A house starts dying long before the roof caves in. Sometimes it dies one silent supper at a time. Folks around Bitter Creek used to say Silas Boone owned the coldest ranch in Montana, and they weren't talking about the winter wind rolling down from the mountains. The Boone Ranch sat 20 miles north of town, where the cottonwoods thinned out, and the earth turned hard and gray beneath a sky that always looked too big for one man to carry alone. By the winter of 1887, even the cattle seemed to know the place was giving up. Fence posts leaned crooked under old snow. The barn doors groaned in the wind like tired bones. Half the north pasture had gone dry 2 summers back, and the creek behind the cabin had shrunk to a thin ribbon of muddy water that barely moved anymore. Men in town said the land was cursed. Others said grief had soaked too deep into the soil. Silas Boone didn't care which one was true. At 41 years old, he had learned that people always needed a reason for why something stopped living. That morning the frost sat thick across the ranch yard, turning every blade of dead grass silver beneath the pale sunrise. Silas stood beside the corral with one gloved hand resting against the wooden rail while his horse breathed steam into the cold air beside him. He stared across the empty pasture without blinking much. The land stretched quiet for nearly 200 acres, but there was no comfort in the silence anymore. Just emptiness. The kind that settled into a man slow over years until he stopped noticing it was there. Behind him the cabin chimney gave off only the thinnest curl of smoke. He had nearly forgotten to light the stove before dawn. Supper dishes from the night before still sat untouched on the table inside. One plate, one fork, one chair pulled close to the fire. Same as every night for the past 7 winters. Silas rubbed his jaw slowly, feeling the rough scrape of beard beneath his glove. Then he looked down at the folded paper in his coat pocket. The bank notice had arrived 3 days ago in a clean white envelope that looked too fine for a place like this. Final extension. Those were the words stamped across the top. He did not need to read. The rest again. By spring, the ranch would belong to another man. A colder man might have cursed. A weaker man might have begged for more time. Silas Boone only folded the letter neatly and slid it back into his pocket like a receipt for something already gone. His horse shifted beside him, restless from the wind. Somewhere near the dry creek bed a loose piece of tin knocked softly against wood over and over again. Clang, clang, clang. The sound carried across the frozen yard while the sky slowly brightened above the mountains. Silas looked toward the cabin window. No light glowed there now. No movement. No waiting. He had once believed a man could outlive loneliness if he worked hard enough. 7 winters had proved otherwise. And still, before climbing into the saddle that morning, he found himself glancing one last time toward the empty porch like part of him expected somebody to open the door. The train pulled out of Bitter Creek Station slow and heavy, iron wheels grinding against frozen rails while smoke drifted low across the evening sky. Clara Whitmore stood alone beneath the depot awning with one worn leather suitcase resting beside her boots and the sharp November wind slipping through the sleeves of her brown wool coat. Most folks had already gone home before the last car disappeared around the bend. The station master locked one side of the freight office and glanced her way twice without saying anything. People in small towns knew how to recognize trouble without needing it explained. Clara kept her eyes on the empty tracks a little longer anyway. Sometimes hope took a few extra seconds to die. In her gloved hand, she still held the letter that had brought her west from St. Louis nearly 2 weeks earlier. The paper had softened at the folds from being read too many times during the train ride. She knew every word by heart now. Practical woman, wanted for companionship and light household duties on a ranch north of Bitter Creek. Room and board provided. Winter work guaranteed. Signed only with initials. E.B. Clara had imagined many things during those long miles across the plains. A small cabin perhaps. A widower needing help. Maybe children. Maybe silence. What she had not imagined was standing alone at sunset while the temperature dropped by the minute and nobody came. The station master finally cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said gently. "You waiting on somebody?" Clara folded the letter carefully before answering. "I was." The old man shifted his hat in his hands. His cheeks were red from the cold, and his gray mustache carried the smell of pipe tobacco. Last boarding house in town fills quick once snow starts coming down. Clara nodded once like she appreciated the information, though her stomach had already tightened at the thought of counting the money left in her purse. $43 and some loose change. Not enough for mistakes. She bent to pick up her suitcase. The handle creaked softly beneath her glove. "Thank you kindly," she said. Then she stepped away from the depot before the man could offer pity. The wind carried the smell of coal smoke and horses through the narrow main street. Lamps glowed warm behind saloon windows, while wagon wheels rolled slow through patches of dirty snow near the boardwalk. Clara walked carefully, keeping one hand pressed against the pocket inside her coat, where her father's old pocket watch rested beside a thin leather journal wrapped in cloth. She had carried both across 3 states without letting them leave her sight once. The journal mattered more than money now. More than the suitcase, too. Her father had handed it to her during the last winter before the fever took him, his rough hands trembling while he told her there were some things in this world people buried because they were afraid of losing them. At the time she thought he meant memories. Now she was not so certain. Halfway down Main Street, she paused outside the Mercantile when a gust of wind lifted loose snow across the road. A rider moved through the haze at the far end of town, broad shoulders bent slightly against the cold, dark coat dusted white near the collar. The horse stepped steady beneath him while townsfolk shifted aside without speaking much. Clara noticed something strange then. Nobody waved at the man. Nobody smiled either. They simply watched him pass the way people watched winter storms rolling over distant hills. Quietly, carefully. The rider slowed near the bank building, reached into his coat, and pulled out a folded paper before disappearing inside beneath the yellow glow of a swinging lantern. The boarding house smelled like boiled potatoes, lamp oil, and wet wool drying near the stove. Clara sat at the far end of the dining room with her hands wrapped around a chipped coffee cup that had long since gone cold. Outside the front window, snow drifted sideways beneath the street lamps, while wagon wheels carved dark tracks through the slush on Main Street. Mrs. Holloway, the boarding house owner, moved slowly between tables collecting empty bowls with the tired patience of a woman who had spent too many winters feeding lonely people. "Storm is settling in early this year," she said while stacking plates beneath one arm. Clara nodded politely, though her thoughts stayed somewhere else entirely. Upstairs in the small room she had rented for 50 cents a night sat her suitcase, her father's watch, and the leather journal wrapped carefully inside one of her dresses. She had checked twice already to make certain the journal remained hidden beneath the lining. Old habits. Her father had trusted very few people near the end. By 9 o'clock, only 3 people remained in the dining room. A traveling salesman asleep beside the stove. A widow sewing quietly near the lamp. And Clara, staring through the frost gathering on the glass, while snow covered Bitter Creek inch by inch. Then the front door opened. Cold wind swept through the room sharp enough to rattle the hanging lamp above the counter. Mrs. Holloway looked up first. The widow stopped sewing. Even the salesman lifted his head halfway from sleep. The man from earlier stepped inside, carrying the smell of horses, cedar smoke, and winter air on his coat. Silas Boone removed his gloves slowly near the door, while melting snow dripped from the brim of his hat onto the wooden floorboards. He looked larger indoors somehow. Broad shoulders, weathered jaw, the kind of stillness that made a room quieter without asking it to be. Mrs. Holloway cleared her throat softly. "Kitchen is nearly closed, Mr. Boone. Coffee is enough." His voice carried low and rough across the room. Not unfriendly, just tired. Clara lowered her eyes toward her cup, though she still noticed the way people watched him carefully when he crossed the room. Like a man carrying bad weather behind him. Silas took the table nearest the window and sat heavily in the chair facing the street. Snow clung to the shoulders of his dark wool coat. His hands looked worn raw from cold and ranch work. When he wrapped them around the steaming mug Mrs. Holloway brought him. For several minutes nobody spoke much. The clock near the staircase ticked steadily while logs cracked inside the stove. Clara tried not to look toward him again. Tried and failed. There was something about the quiet around him that felt familiar. Not comfortable exactly, but recognizable. Like 2 people carrying the same kind of loneliness in different pockets. Mrs. Holloway eventually lowered herself into the chair across from Clara with a sigh. "You said you came here for work?" Clara nodded. "I did." The older woman glanced briefly toward Silas before lowering her voice. "Most ranches already hired before snowfall." Clara followed the glance despite herself. Silas stared out the window as if he had not heard a word. "There is one exception," Mrs. Holloway said carefully. Clara waited. "Boone Ranch." The widow near the lamp looked up immediately at the name. Even the salesman shifted in his chair. Mrs. Holloway folded her hands atop the tablecloth. Problem is, Mr. Boone has not kept help long these past few years. Clara looked toward the window where snow swirled thick beneath the street lamp glow. Why not? She asked softly. The older woman hesitated. Because grief makes a cold house colder. Across the room, Silas lifted his coffee cup halfway before stopping suddenly. His eyes had moved at last. Not toward Mrs. Holloway. Toward Clara. The room seemed smaller after that. Clara could not explain why. Perhaps it was the way Silas Boone looked at her now, steady and unreadable across the dining room, while snow pressed white against the windows behind him. Not curious exactly. More like a man hearing a distant sound he had not expected to hear again. Mrs. Holloway shifted awkwardly in her chair and reached for the coffee pot. Another cup? She asked Clara, though her attention stayed fixed somewhere between the two of them. Clara lowered her eyes first. No, thank you. The older woman nodded and stood, carrying the pot back toward the kitchen while muttering softly about weather and frozen pipes. The widow returned to her sewing. The salesman drifted back to sleep near the stove. Slowly the room settled into quiet again except for the ticking clock and the hiss of wind outside. Clara wrapped both hands around her empty cup for warmth. Her gloves had begun drying near the stove, and without them her fingers looked pale from the cold. Fine hands once perhaps, but not soft anymore. Needle marks near the thumb from years of sewing work. A thin white scar crossing one knuckle from broken factory machinery back in St. Louis. Working hands. Honest hands. She became aware then that Silas was looking at them. Not her face. Her hands. The realization sent a strange stillness through her chest. Most men noticed a woman's face first. Some noticed her clothes. Others her age. Silas Boone looked at the place his life had already worn thin. He finally spoke after several long moments. You came west alone? His voice carried low enough that the others could pretend not to hear. Clara nodded once. Yes. Long trip this time of year. It was. He rubbed one rough thumb slowly against the side of his coffee mug. Dangerous too. Clara almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny. Because the danger had already happened long before the train ride. Sometimes staying put is worse, she said quietly. Something flickered in his expression then. Gone almost before she recognized it. Understanding perhaps. Or memory. Snow rattled softly against the window panes while the hanging lamp swayed overhead. Silas looked back toward the dark street outside. Mrs. Holloway says you are looking for work. I am. You cook. Enough to keep people fed. So. Since I was 12. Cold winters bother you. Clara glanced toward the storm outside. I grew up near the river. Winter always bothers people. They survive it anyway. At that, one corner of Silas Boone's mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. More like the memory of one. He stared into his coffee for a while after that. Clara sensed the room waiting around them somehow. The widow sewing slower now. Mrs. Holloway listening from the kitchen doorway without appearing obvious about it. Even the stove seemed quieter between bursts of cracking wood. Finally Silas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded bank notice Clara had seen earlier outside the bank. He turned it once in his hand before sliding it back again untouched. Ranch needs work, he said. House too. Clara waited. Pay is small. Small is still pay. He nodded once like he respected the answer. Then silence returned again. Not uncomfortable exactly. Just careful. Outside, a horse stamped against the hitching rail beneath the falling snow. Clara noticed then how tired Silas looked beneath the hard edges of his face. Not sleepy tired. Soul tired. Like a man who had spent too many years carrying something heavy without setting it down. He stood slowly from the table and pulled his gloves back on. The chair scraped softly across the floorboards. Road north gets bad after midnight, he said. If you are coming, we leave now. Clara blinked once. Coming where? Silas picked up his hat from the chair beside him. Boone Ranch. The wagon wheels groaned softly beneath fresh snow as they left Bitter Creek behind. Clara sat beside Silas Boone beneath a heavy wool blanket pulled over her lap, while the lantern hanging from the wagon post swayed gently with every rut in the frozen road. The storm had quieted some after midnight, leaving the world washed pale beneath moonlight and drifting snow. Ahead of them the narrow trail disappeared into dark pine country where the mountains rose black against the sky. Silas handled the reins with steady hands, saying little. The horses breathed slow clouds into the cold air while leather harness straps creaked softly in rhythm with their steps. Clara kept both gloved hands wrapped around the tin cup of coffee Mrs. Holloway had pressed into her hands before they left town. The coffee had gone lukewarm miles ago, but she still held it for warmth. For nearly an hour, neither of them spoke much. Strange thing was, the silence did not feel rude. Just careful, like two strangers standing at the edge of frozen water, listening for cracks beneath their feet. Clara studied the dark outline of Silas beside her while the lantern glow brushed against the rough edges of his face. Wind had carved deep lines beside his mouth. His coat smelled faintly of cedar smoke, horses, and winter air. Not unpleasant smells. Honest ones. She noticed the way he checked the horses often without seeming to think about it. The slight pull of the reins before steep turns. The low quiet sounds he made to calm them through icy patches of road. A man used to carrying responsibility alone too long. "You always take strangers home from boarding houses?" she asked finally. Silas looked ahead at the trail. First time. Clara lowered her eyes toward the steaming breath rising from the horses. "Then I suppose I should feel honored." A soft sound escaped him then. Not quite laughter. Closer than before, though. "Do not read much kindness into it," he said. "Ranch needs work. And if I turn out terrible at ranch work, then we survive winter disappointed." Clara almost smiled at that. The wagon rolled onward through snow-covered hills while the moon drifted in and out behind clouds overhead. Far off somewhere a coyote called through the dark. Clara pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Mrs. Holloway said people do not stay long at your ranch. Silas remained quiet, so long she thought he might not answer. Finally he said, "Most folks leave when they realize silence gets loud out there." Clara stared out toward the frozen fields passing beside them. Maybe they were listening to the wrong things. That earned another glance from him. Brief. Measuring. Then he looked back toward the road. Around 2 hours later, the horses slowed near the crest of a long hill. Silas lifted the lantern slightly. There. Clara followed his gaze. At first she saw almost nothing beyond darkness and drifting snow. Then slowly the ranch appeared beneath the moonlight. A weathered cabin sitting alone against the wide Montana valley. Barn leaning slightly east from old wind damage. Corral fences silver with frost. One narrow thread of smoke climbing from the chimney into the freezing night sky. The place looked tired somehow. Not abandoned. Worse than abandoned. Endured. As the wagon rolled closer, Clara noticed the front porch lamp had burned out long ago. No curtains covered the windows. No footprints crossed the yard except old boot tracks half buried beneath snow. Even the wind sounded lonely there. Silas brought the horses to a stop beside the porch and climbed down first. Snow crunched beneath his boots while he tied the reins to the hitching rail. Clara stepped carefully from the wagon a moment later, her legs stiff from the ride. Cold air cut sharp through her coat immediately. For a few seconds neither of them moved. The cabin stood silent before them beneath the pale winter moon. Then Silas picked up her suitcase from the wagon bed and said quietly, "House is colder than it should be. Stove burns weak unless you feed it steady." Clara looked toward the dark windows again. "I have lived through worse." Silas rested her suitcase beside the porch steps. "Most people say that before winter proves them wrong." The cabin smelled of cold ash, old pine boards, and years of winters spent with too few voices inside the walls. Clara stepped through the doorway slowly while Silas moved ahead of her to stir the stove fire back to life. Orange light flickered weakly behind the iron grate, barely pushing the cold from the room. She set her gloves beside the door and looked around without speaking. One table, near the window. One rocking chair beside the stove. Shelves lined neatly with jars, coffee tins, and folded cloths. Everything clean enough to function but untouched by comfort. Like a place built for surviving instead of living. Silas removed his coat and hung it on a peg near the door. Snow melted slowly from his boots onto the wooden floorboards. "Your room is through there," he said, nodding toward a narrow hallway near the back of the cabin. "Blankets are already laid out." Clara thanked him softly and carried her suitcase into the small room. A single bed sat beneath the window with a patchwork quilt folded carefully across the mattress. Wash basin in the corner. Small dresser. Nothing more. She placed her suitcase gently beside the bed and rested her hand against the quilt for a moment. Strange thing was, the room did not feel unwelcoming. Only unfinished. Like a space waiting to remember something it had forgotten. When she returned to the main room, Silas stood near the stove pouring water into a dented kettle. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled halfway up his forearms, revealing skin roughened by weather and work. He moved around the kitchen quietly, each motion practiced from repetition rather than enjoyment. Clara noticed there were only 2 plates in the drying rack beside the sink. One looked used often. The other carried a thin layer of dust around the edges. Silas caught her looking. "Most nights I eat straight from the pot," he said plainly. Clara looked toward the table. "That sounds lonely." He placed the kettle onto the stove without answering. Outside, wind brushed softly against the cabin walls while snow slipped from the roof in slow, heavy thumps. Clara removed her coat and draped it carefully over the chair near the fire. The warmth from the stove finally began reaching her fingers again. "You can stay through winter," Silas said after a while. "If the arrangement works." Clara nodded once. "And if it does not, then spring comes eventually." She studied him quietly then. Most men try to sound harder than they truly were. Silas Boone sounded tired instead. There was a difference. The kettle began to whistle softly. Silas reached for 2 cups from the shelf before pausing briefly, like the second cup surprised him. Clara noticed, but pretended not to. He poured coffee into both anyway, and handed one to her carefully. The heat seeped through the ceramic into her palms. "Thank you." He leaned one shoulder against the counter and stared toward the dark window above the sink. "Road washes out east of the ridge after heavy snow," he said. "If weather holds tomorrow, I will show you where supplies are kept." Clara nodded. "I can help with repairs too. Most things here need repairing." His voice carried no humor, only fact. Clara took a slow sip of coffee while her eyes wandered across the room again. That was when she noticed it, carved faintly into the wooden beam above the stove. A small symbol, nearly hidden beneath smoke stains and age. 3 lines crossing through a circle. Her breath caught softly before she could stop it. The coffee cup lowered slowly in her hands. She knew that mark, knew it well enough to feel her pulse shift beneath her ribs. Her father had drawn that same symbol dozens of times inside the leather journal hidden upstairs in her suitcase. Silas noticed the change in her expression immediately. Something wrong. Clara forced her eyes away from the beam. "No," she said carefully. "I was only looking at the woodwork." But long after Silas turned back toward the stove, Clara kept seeing the symbol in her mind while the wind moved softly outside and the old cabin settled deeper into winter around them. Morning arrived gray and slow across the Boone Ranch. Clara woke before sunrise to the sound of wind brushing against the cabin walls and the faint crackle of dying firewood from the stove in the next room. For a few moments, she lay still beneath the heavy quilt watching pale winter light gather softly across the ceiling above her bed. The room carried the quiet weight of unfamiliar places. Floorboards settling, pipes ticking faintly in the cold. Somewhere outside a horse stamped against frozen ground. Clara pushed herself upright and reached beneath the bed for her suitcase. She unlatched it carefully and removed the leather journal wrapped inside a folded shawl. The cover looked more worn each year, edges softened from handling, corners darkened by her father's hands long before they became hers. She turned slowly through several pages filled with sketches, notes, and strange markings drawn in faded black ink. Then she stopped. 3 lines crossing through a circle, the same symbol carved above Silas Boone's stove downstairs. Her fingers rested against the page while memories surfaced quiet as snowfall. Late nights beside the river in St. Louis. Her father bent over maps beneath lantern light whispering about land farther west. Water hidden beneath dry earth. Old agreements between men who trusted handshakes more than banks. At the time she had barely listened. Children rarely understand which stories matter until years later. A floorboard creaked softly outside her room. Clara closed the journal immediately and slid it back beneath her dresses just before a knock sounded against the doorframe. "Coffee is ready," Silas said from the hallway. "Thank you. I will be out in a minute." His footsteps moved away again, slow and steady. Clara exhaled quietly before fastening the suitcase shut. Downstairs the cabin smelled warmer than the night before. Coffee brewing. Bacon cooking lightly in the cast-iron skillet. Fresh wood smoke drifting from the stove. Clara paused near the bottom stair for a moment, surprised by the smell alone. Some houses carried loneliness stronger in daylight. This one seemed softer somehow beneath morning firelight. Silas stood at the counter slicing bread with careful motions while snow drifted outside the kitchen window. He had already been out to the barn judging by the frost melting along the shoulders of his coat. Clara noticed a second coffee cup waiting near the stove before he even looked toward her. Small thing, but not accidental. Storm eased some overnight, he said. Road should hold through tomorrow. Clara stepped toward the stove and wrapped both hands around the warm mug. That is good news. Depends who is traveling. She looked toward him over the rim of the cup. And are you expecting somebody? Bankman eventually. The answer came flat and simple. Clara lowered the cup slowly. Mrs. Holloway mentioned the ranch was struggling. Silas nodded once without looking up from the breadboard. Cattle prices dropped 3 years straight. Creek. Dried worse each summer. Winter feed costs more than the herd is worth now. Clara listened quietly while the stove popped softly behind her. There was no bitterness in his voice. Only exhaustion worn thin from repeating facts too long. She moved toward the table carrying the coffee with her and noticed something near the far wall beside the pantry door. Another mark. Smaller than the one above the stove, but carved into the wood trim low near the floorboards. 3 lines crossing through a circle. Her pulse shifted again. Different placement this time. Lower. Almost deliberate. Clara sat slowly at the table while studying the mark from the corner of her eye. Silas finally brought over 2 plates and placed one carefully in front of her before taking the opposite chair. Neither spoke for several moments. Snow drifted softly outside while steam curled upward from their coffee cups between them. Then Clara asked as calmly as she could, "How long has this cabin been in your family?" Silas tore a piece of bread slowly in half. "Since my father built it." "Did he carve symbols into the walls often?" His hand stopped moving, just for a second. Then he looked up at her fully for the first time that morning. Silas did not answer right away. The fire crackled softly between them while morning light crept pale across the kitchen floorboards. Clara watched him carefully over the rim of her coffee cup. Men usually revealed themselves most honestly in silence, not speech. Silas Boone carried silence the way some men carried old injuries. Carefully, like moving too fast might reopen something. Finally, he set down his bread. "My father carved all sorts of things into wood," he said. "Fence posts, barn beams, door frames." Clara glanced again toward the small symbol near the pantry. Did he ever explain what they meant? No, his eyes shifted briefly toward the mark before returning to his plate. "I figured it was rancher nonsense. Survey markings maybe." Clara lowered her gaze before he could read too much in her face. Survey markings. Close enough to truth without touching it. The conversation drifted after that into ordinary things. Feed storage. Water barrels freezing overnight. Which cabinet held flour? Where extra blankets were kept. But even while Silas spoke, Clara kept noticing the symbols now hidden quietly throughout the cabin. One faintly carved near the staircase railing. Another burned into the underside of a shelf beside the stove. Always the same design. 3 lines crossing through a circle. Her father had once called it the marker of hidden water. She remembered that now with sudden clarity. Dry land lies, he had whispered over old maps spread across their kitchen table years ago. But water always leaves signs if you know where to look. By afternoon, the storm clouds had broken enough for weak sunlight to spill across the valley outside. Silas spent most of the day repairing part of the north fence while Clara cleaned the cabin room by room. Dust rose softly through golden beams of winter light, while she scrubbed shelves, shook out old rugs, and opened windows briefly to clear the stale cold air trapped inside the walls. Strange how quickly a house responded to attention. By late afternoon, the cabin already felt different somehow. Not warmer exactly. More awake. Clara tied fresh curtains back beside the kitchen window and stepped onto the porch rug to beat dust from it when she noticed Silas returning from the pasture carrying an armload of split wood. He stopped near the porch steps and looked toward the front window. Clara followed his gaze. The sunlight caught the clean glass now instead of months of dust. Inside, the stove burned brighter. Curtains open, kettles steaming softly on the fire. Something unreadable crossed his face then. Not surprise. Something quieter than that. Like a man seeing light inside an old church after years away. He carried the wood inside without comment. Later that evening, Clara knelt near the pantry searching for extra candles while the wind rose stronger outside again. Her fingers brushed beneath the bottom shelf and struck something hollow beneath the floorboards. She paused immediately. The sound came again when she pressed lightly against the wood. Hollow. Clara sat back slowly onto her heels. Most of the cabin floor sounded solid beneath her movements. This section did not. Her pulse quickened before she could stop it. Across the room, Silas sat near the stove repairing a leather harness strap beneath lamplight. "Everything all right over there?" he asked without looking up. Clara rested one hand against the floor carefully. "I think this board is loose." Silas glanced toward her briefly. "Whole house is loose." But Clara had already noticed something else. Near the edge of the floorboard, hidden beneath years of dust, sat another carving almost too small to see. 3 lines crossing through a circle. Her heartbeat thudded once hard against her ribs. Slowly she slid her fingers beneath the edge of the board and pulled upward. The wood lifted easier than expected with a soft scrape against old nails. Beneath it lay darkness, dust, and the corner of something wrapped in oilcloth hidden carefully between the beams underneath the cabin floor. For a moment Clara forgot the cold entirely. She knelt beside the open floorboard with one hand still resting against the rough wood while the oilcloth bundle sat hidden beneath years of dust and silence. The lantern light flickered softly across the opening, casting long shadows between the beams under the cabin floor. Across the room, Silas set down the leather harness strap and stood slowly from his chair. His boots crossed the floorboards with steady weight until he stopped beside her. "What did you find?" Clara looked up at him briefly before reaching carefully into the narrow space. Dust coated her sleeve as her fingers closed around the bundle. It felt heavier than expected, carefully wrapped, deliberately hidden. She lifted it into the light and brushed loose dirt from the oilcloth with trembling hands. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The cabin seemed quieter suddenly except for the soft hiss of the stove behind them and the wind moving along the roof outside. Finally, Silas crouched beside her. "Open it." Clara untied the thin leather cord securing the bundle. The oilcloth peeled back slowly, revealing a stack of folded papers protected between thin sheets of waxed canvas. Old papers. Very old. The edges had yellowed with age, but the ink remained surprisingly clear beneath the lantern light. Clara unfolded the top page carefully. The moment she saw the handwriting, her breath caught hard in her throat. She knew those letters. Knew the shape of every line and curve before her mind fully accepted it. Her father's handwriting. Silas noticed immediately. "You recognize it?" Clara nodded slowly, without looking away from the page. "It is my father's." Silence settled heavy between them. The fire cracked softly in the stove. Outside, the wind rattled loose snow against the cabin walls. Clara turned another page with careful fingers. Maps. Survey sketches. Water flow measurements. Notes written tightly along the margins. Then one name appeared near the bottom corner beneath a faded date from 22 years earlier. Elias Whitmore. Beside it sat another signature. Samuel Boone. Silas stared at the paper for a long moment before speaking. "My father." Clara looked toward him slowly. They knew each other. He took the page from her gently and studied the signatures beneath the lantern glow. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Confusion first, then something deeper. Memory trying to surface through years of silence. "I remember hearing his name once," Silas said quietly. "A man from back east came through when I was a boy. Stayed here near a month." Clara lowered herself onto the floor beside the open boards. Her pulse still had not settled. "My father disappeared for 6 weeks when I was 11, she whispered. "When he returned home, he carried maps everywhere afterward." Silas unfolded another paper. This one showed rough drawings of the Boone Valley with circles marked near the North Ridge and creek bed. Strange symbols covered the margins. 3 lines crossing through circles again and again. Clara leaned closer immediately. "These are water markers." Silas looked toward her. "Water?" She nodded. "My father studied underground spring systems. Hidden water beneath dry land." She touched one faded marking near the ridge. "He used symbols instead of names when he wanted to keep locations private." Silas sat back slowly on his heels. "Why hide water?" Clara looked around the old cabin, then toward the frozen darkness outside the windows. "Because in places like Montana, water is worth more than gold." The words settled quietly between them. The ranch. The dying creek. The dried pastureland. The bank notice folded in Silas Boone's coat pocket. Suddenly the maps beneath the floorboards no longer felt like old forgotten papers. They felt alive. Silas reached for another folded sheet near the bottom of the bundle. This one was thicker than the others, more worn. He opened it carefully beneath the lantern light while Clara watched his face. Halfway through reading, he stopped moving entirely. Clara saw the color drain slightly from his expression. "What is it?" she asked softly. Silas lifted his eyes toward her slowly, disbelief written plain across his weathered face for the first time since she had known him. Then he turned the page toward her. At the top, written clearly beneath both their father signatures, sat a single sentence. "If the creek ever runs dry, the spring beneath Boone Ridge must remain hidden until the right heir returns." Neither of them slept much that night. The papers remained spread across the kitchen table beneath the lantern while snow drifted softly outside the cabin windows and the fire settled low inside the stove. Clara sat wrapped in a wool blanket with her father's journal open beside the maps from beneath the floorboards. Every few minutes, she compared symbols between the pages, tracing faded markings carefully with one fingertip while Silas watched from the opposite side of the table. He had stopped pretending this was coincidence hours ago. Too many names. Too many matching signs carved into the cabin walls. Too many years spent watching his ranch dry out without understanding why his father refused to sell certain pieces of land, no matter how desperate things became. "Here," Clara whispered finally. She turned the journal toward him beneath the lantern glow. "This symbol means underground movement." Silas leaned closer. "Movement of what?" "Water." She pointed toward another page where her father had sketched the Boone Valley decades earlier. Thin lines curved beneath the ridge north of the ranch house. "My father believed there was a spring system running beneath this land." Silas stared at the drawings. "Then why hide it?" Clara looked toward the dark windows where wind carried loose snow across the yard outside. "Because water changes everything out here." Her voice stayed soft. "Towns fight over it. Ranchers lose land over it. Railroads buy entire valleys for it." Silence settled between them again, the kind filled with understanding neither person fully wanted yet. Silas leaned back slowly in his chair and rubbed both hands across his tired face. "All these years," he murmured. "The creek drying up. My father refusing offers from land buyers." He looked toward the maps again. Maybe he knew. Clara studied him quietly across the lantern light. His shoulders looked heavy tonight. Not only from exhaustion, from realization. Sometimes answers weighed more than questions once they finally arrived. Around midnight the wind eased enough for stillness to settle over the ranch completely. Clara rose from the table to add another log to the stove. Warm light spilled across the floorboards while the old cabin creaked softly around them. She noticed then that Silas had not touched the bank notice sitting folded beside his elbow all evening. The paper remained unopened despite everything they had discovered. "How much time do you have?" she asked gently. Silas did not pretend to misunderstand. "Before the bank takes the ranch." Clara nodded. He stared into the stove for several seconds before answering. "Maybe 6 weeks. Less if winter feed runs short." Clara looked down at the maps spread across the table. 6 weeks. Her father's journal suddenly felt less like memory and more like responsibility placed directly into her hands. She moved back toward the table slowly and unfolded another page from the hidden bundle. This one contained detailed notes written tighter than the others. Measurements, distances, land markers. Then near the bottom sat a sentence underlined twice in dark ink. "The spring opens only where cedar roots meet ironstone beneath the north ridge." Clara's pulse quickened. "Silas." He looked up immediately. She slid the page toward him. "I think they left directions." He stood from the table at once, chair scraping softly across the floorboards. Together they bent over the map, while lantern light flickered across the old paper between them. North Ridge, Cedar Grove, Ironstone Shelf, landmarks scattered through the valley beyond the cabin. Silas traced one rough finger along the edge of the map toward a narrow section near the dried creek bed. "There are old cedar trees there," he said quietly. "Half-mile east of the north pasture." Clara turned another page from her father's journal and froze again. A final sketch filled the paper this time. Crude, but unmistakable. A drawing of the Boone cabin. Beneath it, an arrow pointing toward the ridge. And beside the drawing, written in her father's careful handwriting, sat 6 words that made the room feel suddenly colder despite the fire burning strong nearby. "Trust no banker. Especially Arthur Bellamy." Silas stared at the name hard enough that the muscles in his jaw tightened visibly. Clara looked up slowly. You know him? Silas nodded once. He owns the bank in Bitter Creek. Outside, somewhere beyond the frozen pasture, a horse whinnied softly in the dark while the wind carried snow across the valley, and the old Boone ranch held its secrets a little tighter through the long Montana night. The next morning dawned sharp and bright after days of snowfall. Sunlight spilled across the Boone Valley in long pale ribbons while frost clung to the fence rails and the frozen pasture glittered. Beneath the Montana sky, Clara stood near the kitchen window holding her father's journal against her chest while Silas saddled the horses outside. His movements carried a different kind of energy this morning. Still quiet, still careful, but no longer defeated. Hope changed a man slowly at first, like warmth returning to frozen hands. We ride north after breakfast, he said when he stepped back inside carrying cold air and the smell of cedar on his coat. Clara nodded and moved toward the stove where coffee simmered softly beside the skillet. She had risen before dawn to bake fresh biscuits from the last sack of flour in the pantry. The smell filled the cabin, now warm and comforting against the winter cold outside. Silas noticed immediately when he removed his gloves. His eyes moved toward the table where 2 plates already waited beside the stove. Small thing again, but Clara saw the way his shoulders eased slightly at the sight. Neither of them mentioned it. They sat together quietly while morning light crept across the floorboards. Steam curled from their coffee cups between them. Outside, horses shifted impatiently near the corral gate. For the first time since Clara arrived at the ranch, the silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt shared. Halfway through breakfast, the sound of wagon wheels rolled faintly across the frozen yard outside. Silas looked up immediately. So did Clara. The wheels stopped near the porch. A moment later came the heavy knock against the cabin door. 3 sharp raps. Not neighborly. Silas stood slowly from the table. Clara saw his expression close off at once like shutters against approaching weather. He crossed the room and opened the door. Arthur Bellamy stood on the porch beneath a dark wool overcoat trimmed too fine for ranch country. Snow dusted the shoulders of his hat, while polished boots gleamed against the rough wooden boards beneath him. Behind him waited a second man beside the wagon, younger and thinner, carrying a leather satchel beneath one arm. The banker smiled without warmth. Morning, Boone. Silas did not invite him inside. Road is long for social calls. Bellamy glanced past him into the cabin anyway. His eyes settled briefly on Clara near the stove before returning to Silas. Business rarely waits for weather. Clara lowered her eyes toward the coffee cups while listening carefully. Bellamy removed a folded paper from inside his coat. I came to discuss your extension. Silas leaned one shoulder against the doorframe, blocking most of the entrance. Discussion already happened. Circumstances change. Bellamy's smile thinned slightly, especially when rumors start traveling through town. Silas said nothing. The younger man beside the wagon shifted awkwardly in the cold. Clara noticed then that Bellamy's attention kept drifting toward the cabin itself. The windows, the porch, the floor, like a man studying property already counted as his. Heard you took in a boarder. Bellamy continued lightly. Generous of you considering your finances. Clara felt the words settle sharp beneath the surface politeness. Silas did not move from the doorway. You came here to talk about my debts or my guests. For the first time, Bellamy's smile disappeared entirely. Careful, Boone. Banks own more ranches than snowstorms do these days. Silence followed. The wind stirred softly across the yard while somewhere near the barn a horse stamped against frozen ground. Clara watched Silas carefully then. Watched the stillness settle through him. Not fear. Decision. Bellamy finally unfolded the paper in his hand and held it toward him. You have 30 days now instead of 6 weeks. Consider it mercy. Clara's breath caught softly. Silas took the notice without looking at it. And if I refuse? Bellamy adjusted his gloves slowly. Then I suppose the Boone Ranch becomes available to men prepared to use the land properly. His eyes drifted briefly toward the north ridge visible beyond the cabin windows. Just for a second. But Clara saw it. So did Silas. The banker knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough. Bellamy tipped his hat once before stepping back from the porch. Good morning to you both. The wagon wheels creaked again moments later as the men disappeared down the snowy trail toward town. Inside the cabin, silence lingered long after the sound faded away. Then slowly Silas closed the door, turned the lock, and looked toward Clara with a hardness in his eyes she had not seen before. "We ride now," he said quietly, "before somebody else finds that spring first." They rode north through the valley beneath a sky the color of cold steel. Snow cracked softly beneath the horses' hooves while the wind carried the sharp scent of cedar through the frozen hills. Clara kept her father's journal wrapped carefully inside her coat, one gloved hand resting against it. Every few minutes, as though she feared the pages might disappear if she stopped touching them. Ahead of her, Silas rode in silence, shoulders squared against the winter wind, eyes fixed toward the north ridge rising dark against the horizon. By midday they reached the edge of the cedar grove marked on the map. The trees stood thick along the hillside, their branches heavy with fresh snow while iron-colored rock pushed through the earth beneath them in jagged shelves. Clara slid carefully from her horse and pulled the journal free beneath the pale afternoon light. "The spring should be close," she said quietly. Silas looped the reins around a low branch and stepped beside her. Together they studied the land. Cedar roots, ironstone, dry creek bed below. Everything matched the map too perfectly now to dismiss as old stories. Clara moved slowly across the ridge while comparing the land to her father's notes. Every few feet, she paused beside markings carved faintly into stone or tree bark nearly hidden beneath weather and time. 3 lines crossing through circles, trail signs, directions, proof that 2 men had once guarded this secret carefully. The wind rose stronger around them as afternoon drifted toward evening. Silas climbed onto a narrow shelf of exposed rock and stopped suddenly. "Clara." She looked up immediately. He pointed toward the base of an old cedar tree growing sideways from the hillside. Snow had slipped away there, revealing a circle of dark earth beneath the roots. Clara hurried toward him, boots sliding lightly against frozen ground. Then she saw it too. Moisture. Tiny beads of water gathering slowly between cracks in the ironstone beneath the tree roots. Her breath caught. Silas crouched carefully and brushed snow aside with one rough hand. More water shimmered beneath the surface. Not frozen. Moving. "Dear Lord," he murmured. Clara opened the journal with trembling fingers and found the final sketch again. Cedar roots meet ironstone. The hidden spring breathes below. Her father had been right all along. Silas sat back slowly against the rock shelf, staring at the water like a man seeing hope after years spent preparing for loss. Snow drifted softly around them while the winter sun lowered beyond the valley. Clara watched him quietly then, watched the hardness in his face loosen piece by piece beneath the fading light. "This ranch can survive now," she said softly. Silas looked toward the valley below where the Boone land stretched pale beneath snow and dusk. "Maybe," but his voice carried something uncertain still. Clara closed the journal carefully against her chest. "You do not sound convinced." He stood slowly beside her. For a long moment, he only looked across the frozen pasturelands below. Then finally he spoke. "Because people change when land becomes valuable." Clara understood immediately. Bankers, buyers, men who measured worth in acreage and contracts instead of homes and memories. She lowered her eyes toward the journal. "Arthur Bellamy will come back." "Yes." Silence stretched between them while wind moved softly through the cedar branches overhead. Then Clara took a slow breath. "Maybe I should leave before that happens." The words surprised even her once spoken aloud. Silas turned toward her immediately. "Leave?" Clara forced herself to hold his gaze. "This secret belonged to my father too. Bellamy may already suspect that. If staying here puts the ranch at risk, then perhaps it is better if I go before he starts asking questions." For a second, the only sound came from the wind and the distant creak of tree branches shifting beneath snow. Silas stared at her with an expression she could not fully read. Hurt perhaps, or disbelief. Then slowly he stepped closer until only cold winter air remained between them. "This ranch was dying long before you arrived," he said quietly. Clara felt her breath catch. Silas looked toward the cabin, smoke rising faintly in the distance below them. "You are the first living thing that has come back to it in years." The words settled softly between them beneath the falling snow while somewhere beneath the frozen ridge hidden water moved steadily through the earth, patient as time itself. Winter loosened its grip on the Boone Valley one slow day at a time. By late March the snow along the north ridge had begun melting into narrow silver streams that cut through the pastureland beneath pale Montana sunlight. The frozen creek behind the cabin no longer sat dry and silent. Water moved there now. Real water. Clear and steady against the rocks. Clara stood on the porch one early morning wrapped in her brown wool shawl, while steam curled upward from the coffee cup, warming her hands. She listened to the sound for a long while. Moving water. It changed the entire ranch somehow. The horses drank easier. The cattle stopped wandering restlessly along broken fence lines. Even the wind sounded softer crossing the valley now that the land no longer felt thirsty. Behind her the cabin door creaked open. Silas stepped outside carrying his work gloves and a coil of fencing wire over one shoulder. Morning sunlight caught lightly in his dark hair, while the cold air turned his breath pale around him. He paused beside Clara without speaking at first. That had become their way over the past weeks. Quiet no longer meant distance between them. Some mornings it simply meant peace. Clara handed him the second cup of coffee waiting beside her on the porch rail. Silas accepted it with one rough hand and looked out across the ranch. The north pasture stretched green in places now where snow had melted away completely. New grass pushed carefully through the thawing earth. Fence should hold another season, he said after a while. Clara smiled faintly into her coffee. You said that 2 weeks ago. This time I mean it. She glanced toward him then. The lines beside his eyes looked softer lately. He slept more now. Ate regularly. Sometimes she even caught him humming low under his breath while working near the barn, though he always stopped the moment he noticed her listening. Strange how healing arrived quietly in people. Not through grand moments. Through mornings. Through supper waiting warm on the stove. Through another cup already poured before a person asked for it. Arthur Bellamy had returned once near the end of February with papers prepared neatly inside his leather satchel. He left less than 20 minutes later after Silas informed him the Boone Ranch debts would be settled before spring branding season. The banker smiled tightly the entire conversation, but Clara noticed the way his eyes lingered uneasily toward the north pasture afterward. Men like Bellamy understood money well enough. They also understood when they had lost. Now the ranch belonged to silence again. Good silence this time. Living silence. Clara took another slow sip of coffee while sunlight spilled warmer across the porch boards beneath their boots. Near the barn 2 calves wandered awkwardly beside their mothers through the muddy spring pasture. Somewhere beyond the ridge a meadowlark called through the morning air for the first time since winter. Silas rested one elbow against the porch rail beside her. I found something yesterday while clearing the east shed. Clara looked up curiously. What? He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small brass key darkened by age. My father must have hidden it years ago. Clara turned it gently in her fingers. Tiny markings had been carved along the handle. 3 lines crossing through a circle. She smiled softly at the sight. Another secret. Maybe. Silas studied her quietly for a moment before adding. Or maybe some things were only meant to be found once the right person arrived. Clara lowered her eyes toward the key resting warm in her palm. Wind moved softly through the valley carrying the smell of cedar, wet earth, and coffee drifting from the open cabin door behind them. Inside, 2 plates already waited on the kitchen table beside the stove. 2 cups. 2 chairs pulled close to the fire. The house no longer felt unfinished. And when Silas reached for the fencing wire and started down the porch steps toward the pasture below, he paused halfway there and looked back toward her like a man who finally expected someone to still be standing there when he returned home. An abandoned bride arrives in a frozen Montana town with nothing but a worn suitcase, her late father's journal, and a secret buried beneath the land of a lonely rancher who has almost given up on life. In this emotional Western cowboy story, a cold and silent cowboy discovers that the quiet woman he brought home may be the only person capable of saving his dying ranch from ruin. As winter closes around the valley, hidden maps, forgotten promises, and an underground spring begin to reveal a truth kept secret for decades. This Western cowboy romance blends slow burn emotion, healing love, frontier survival, and the feeling of finally finding a place to belong. Through lantern light, snow-covered pastures, warm coffee beside the stove, and long silent suppers, the rancher and the abandoned bride slowly rebuild not only the land, but themselves. Fans of heartfelt Western cowboy storytelling will love this deeply atmospheric tale filled with loneliness, hope, hidden inheritance, and quiet emotional connection. If you enjoy cinematic ranch life, gentle cowboy romance, emotional frontier stories, and immersive Western cowboy narratives with rich scenery and meaningful character bonds, this story delivers a powerful journey of healing beneath the wide Montana sky. Experience a timeless Western cowboy tale where love grows slowly, secrets rise from beneath the earth, and two lonely souls finally discover what home truly means. Create me a 28-year-old white American frontier woman from 1887 Montana, front-facing portrait, wearing a brown wool coat, faded calico dress, knitted beige shawl, worn leather boots, simple low-bun hairstyle, gentle tired eyes, realistic cinematic lighting, dusty winter ranch atmosphere. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. Create me a 41-year-old white American cowboy rancher from 1887 Montana, front-facing portrait, rugged weathered face, tired blue eyes, light stubble, dark cowboy hat, worn denim shirt, heavy wool coat, leather gloves, cinematic winter ranch lighting, realistic frontier atmosphere. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. Won a cinematic 1887 Montana Western confrontation during a violent snowstorm at dusk outside a weathered ranch corral. Rugged white cowboy rancher with tired blue eyes, dark cowboy hat, heavy wool coat, leather gloves, standing protectively in front of a white frontier woman wearing a brown wool coat, faded calico dress, knitted shawl, wind violently blowing their clothing and hair. Emotional fear and determination on their faces. Wealthy banker and two ranch men confronting them near frightened. Horses and muddy frozen ground. Dramatic lantern light glowing through heavy snow. Cinematic Western realism. Intense emotional atmosphere. Realistic human anatomy. Historically accurate clothing. Dusty ranch environment. Deep shadows. Cinematic camera angle. Highly detailed faces. Emotional storytelling composition. Realistic cold weather textures. Realistic snow particles. No fantasy elements. No modern objects. Realistic cinematic Western photography. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. 1-2.